Peadar Tóibín.
Míle mágad, I count Corlia. Taoiseach, information given to Aontú by the HSE shows that well over 40% of COVID deaths in Ireland are linked to hospital or nursing home outbreaks. That's 3,500 people who have died because they've contracted COVID in a nursing home or in a hospital. So, for example, these are people who went into a hospital with a broken leg and came out in a coffin. It's a human disaster of enormous proportions. And incredibly, the people who were most vulnerable during the COVID crisis were actually the people who were most exposed. Throughout COVID, the government were focusing on restricting people to 2 kilometres from their homes, preventing people from going to funerals, to school and to work, when in reality, the most dangerous place you could be was in a nursing home or a hospital. The 2 locations run or regulated by the state. Now, no government could get everything right. We accept that. But there were serious and disastrous mistakes made during COVID. Documents released to Aontú by the National Treatment Purchase Fund show that 10,000 people were discharged from hospitals into nursing homes at the start of COVID. And many of those who were discharged were not tested for COVID. So that had the effect of seeding those nursing homes with COVID. Staffing was chaotic during those nursing homes. And indeed, the Minister for Health, who was an opposition TD at the time, stated in this chamber that the HSE were intercepting staff and PPE from going into nursing homes. The head of Nursing Homes Ireland actually tried to get a meeting with Simon Harris, who was the minister then, to draw attention to this crisis, but none was forthcoming for weeks. Nursing homes were so short-staffed that they were phoning relatives and asking for help. Nursing homes were going on Facebook looking for help. In one case, I remember where a nursing home manager literally went on the radio in tears to discuss how 2 staff were left in charge for 48 hours of a nursing home when 5 people died around them. They could not get the necessary staff to help them out. Minister Mary Butler wrote to Paul Reid, as did Phelim Quinn, CEO of HICWA, urging for more staff. No reply for weeks, and finally Paul Reid wrote back that everything was fine. There was no pressure. Shockingly, at this time, Simon Harris created the Be On Call for Ireland initiative, where 73,000 people signed up. Medics, nurses came home from abroad to do their civic duty for this country. How many people were ever recruited from that? Around 450 people. Only 10% of that database of people were ever contacted by this government. A tiny fraction. Now, the government are saying that they're carrying out a review. Are you for real, Taoiseach? Are you saying that the deaths of 3,500 people only warrants a review? Why does the government oppose a public investigation that would find out the truth and provide justice for families who've lost loved ones so tragically in the COVID crisis?
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, Deputy. I remember the pandemic very well, and I remember it almost on a day-to-day basis, and I remember the very difficult decisions and very different judgment calls that had to be made at different points in time, often without much information. At the very start, we knew very little about the virus, in fact, and you recall that at the time. It wasn't even clear at the start whether asymptomatic transmission was even possible. That became clear later during the pandemic. So I think it's always going to be the case that with hindsight, things will look differently than they did at the time when we had so little information. But I do remember something that Paul Reid, the head of the HSE at the time, said at the start of the pandemic. He said there's no roadmap, there's no playbook, there's no lived experience as to how you deal with the pandemic of this nature, and we'd probably get about 70% of things right and 30% of things wrong. And I think that's probably correct. But it is important that we find out what we got right and what we got wrong, and that's why there will be a public inquiry, and a public inquiry will be established this year to examine how the pandemic was handled in Ireland, not just the healthcare aspects of it, such as what happened in hospitals and nursing homes, but also testing, the public health advice that was given around mass antigen tests, all those things that became controversial, and also the economic response. All these things need to be inquired into, and I'm committed to have that inquiry up and running, and to have it up and running this year. In relation to there being a lack of staff, there was a lack of staff at various points during the pandemic. It was often the case that staff were just unavailable. In some cases, staff were unwilling to go into nursing homes for fear of getting the virus themselves, and I can understand that. And in other cases, when people were contacted because they'd offered their services, they weren't available when they were contacted. And that was the real experience that I would have had of it during that period of time. And you recall during that time I re-registered as a doctor myself and took part in both the vaccine programme and the occupational health programme prior to that. I do think the characterisation that you mentioned at the start, Deputy, wasn't particularly accurate. I'm sure it is the case that there were people who went into hospital who were in very good health and perhaps had something like a broken leg and contracted a virus and died of it. That unfortunately does happen in healthcare, and it's never something anybody wants to see happen. But the vast majority of people who died of COVID in Ireland were people who were elderly and people who had underlying medical conditions. And that is how viruses work. And that would have been the case in the community, as well as hospitals and as well as nursing homes. And out of respect to the relatives of the thousands of people who did die in hospitals and nursing homes, we shouldn't create the impression that all or even most of those deaths were preventable. Some of them might have been, but nobody dies of natural causes. There's always a reason, and very often it's a respiratory infection or a urinary tract infection. And people who are elderly and people who have comorbidities, that is the thing that they get at the end, and that is the cause of death. But it's not the case that those deaths were all or even mostly preventable. And I think it's important, out of respect to those families, many of whom are still grieving, that we don't create a false impression in that regard.
Deputy Tóibín.
It's important to repeat that the information that we received is characterised that these individuals, these 3,500 people who died, contracted COVID in a nursing home or in a hospital. And out of respect to those people who've lost loved ones, they should be entitled to the truth and entitled to justice in relation to what happened to them. They want information here. They want not a nebulous review or inquiry. They want a commission of investigation that happens in a public fashion. Because if they don't do it, if you don't achieve that for them, they will not get to the bottom of what happens to their loved ones. They'll not get to the justice of what happens to their loved ones. And actual fact, right now, the information that we've got shows that 44 families are currently starting legal action against the state as a result of what happened. Now, my worry is, if there isn't a full public investigation, what we're going to have is the time-honoured example of this government aggressively litigating against those families who lost loved ones in the same manner that you've done in numerous other occasions, so that they spend years tied up in the justice system, expending massive amounts of their own resources trying to achieve justice. Will you go on the record say that we'll have a full commission of investigation in relation to this tragedy?
Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. We will have a full public inquiry into how the pandemic was handled in Ireland. That will include what happened in nursing homes, it will include what happened in hospitals, it will include what happened in the community and the wider economic and social response. The exact format of that we haven't decided on yet, but I do want it to be done properly. And whether that's using the Commission Investigations mechanism, which has its pros and cons, or a tribunal mechanism or a different mechanism, I'm open to that being considered, but there are pluses and minuses to all of these mechanisms, and I don't think it'll be done quickly, by the way. I think it will take time, and it will take time to do it properly, but I'm determined to have that up and running this year, ideally by the middle of the year. But again, I think it is important that we're honest with people. With the best will in the world, even with the best infection control procedures, it isn't always possible to keep viruses out of hospitals and out of nursing homes. If it's not brought in by the staff, it's brought in by the visitors, it's brought in by the patients. And that is just the reality of it. And I think if you look at the same statistics the world over, you will see a similar profile. A very high proportion of people who sadly died of COVID would have picked it up in a healthcare setting or in a nursing home. And that is the nature of a virus.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
And I think we need to be serious about looking into the issues that you raise, and you're right to raise these issues, but we also need to not create the false impression as to how viruses work and what was possible and what wasn't.